Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining. Today, Brett Marquard will be speaking. He's going to be talking about the Argonaut project. He's going to be giving an overview of the projects and talking about new projects for 2021. So, Brett, you ready to go, sir?
Right. Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone. Hope your Dev Days is going well. Hi, I'm Brett Marquard, principal at Wave One. Background in EHR development implementation, but of course, Standards has pulled me in and have spent a lot of time developing the Argonaut data query guides, primary editor for US Core, and now serving as a project manager for Argonaut. So there's a lot to cover in this session, and this is a slightly different session than probably the others you've been in that there'll be a bit of background in Argonaut for folks who are not familiar with the community. Then we'll talk about some of the key prior initiatives. There's a lot of them, and so I'm going to cruise through them and you're probably gonna want more detail on some of them. And fortunately, there's lots of sessions available this week for you to hop over to and learn more. And then we'll spend a little time talking about our plans for 2021 and I'll leave you from there. So here we go. So up first, what is the Argonaut project? It's interesting. It's a community of folks, both technology vendors, provider organizations, payers, consulting groups, client developers that have come together to accelerate the use of FHIR and OAuth in healthcare. It was formed about 6 years ago. It's a few things that important to say is what we are not is that we're not a standards development organization and that not a separate legal entity or proprietary activity. We're a group of private individuals and organizations who've come together to try to solve important complex problems of healthcare. And what's funny about Argonaut too is we're not, in the case, we don't think of not invented here. So we're happy to latch on to other initiatives. We've done more than one with the Smart Collaborative saying, hey, they've done some good work over there. Let's pick up and accelerate that. And I've done that with other partners also. So in terms of just to give you a taste of who's involved in Argonaut, you'll see a pretty good mix of technology vendors. I shouldn't say pretty good, but a really strong mix of technology vendors. Provider organizations, of course, you need clinical input. We get that from both our technology vendors and provider organizations to make sure we build the best possible guidance. In terms of contractor support, we've had pretty consistent since the beginning. Graham Grieve and Josh Mendel and Eric Haas have been essentially involved since the very beginning. And most recently, Gino and Carl have joined to lead some of the most recent initiatives. In terms of project management, Mickey Tripathi was our fearless leader up until January this year when he was called up to the big leagues to be our national coordinator. And so I stepped into that role for this year. So a little bit of timeline on Argonaut. I think in the keynote session this morning or the roundtable, you heard a lot about this JSON report. And so the JSON report, if you go back in time, 2014, even before that, there's a group of really smart scientists who wrote a report and said, hey, the state of technology in healthcare, it's not great. And there was some mention of API in there, and there's some other stuff in there that, let's just say, didn't paint the industry in the most positive light. And so a JSON task force was formed with some key folks around it to say, what are we going to do with this report? What are our recommendations? And as a result of that task force, the call to action was issued to APIs and to look at FHIR. And 2 months after, which is pretty dang fast, the launch of the Argonaut project happened. And so into 2015, initial testing, some testing of looking at FHIR, looking at Smart on FHIR, and ONC later that year released their EHR certification with an API requirement. The way ONC did this is pretty savvy. Instead of saying, we're going to name FHIR. And remember, FHIR at that stage, it wasn't the clear winner. It was, only 4 years old in standards speak. That's, probably about learning to crawl for standards, and maybe even before that. But they basically said to be certified, you have to provide open API access, named a few key common clinical data elements, and then require documentation on the web. So that kind of set direction of open APIs is where we'd like to go. Industry, let's figure out how to do that. So the Argonaut project and others, stepped up, and a lot of testing was done, and a pretty important event in December 2016, publication of the Argonaut Data Query Implementation Guide. It had been built off some of the existing work out there in industry, leveraged some experience from SMART, some of the ONC data access framework, but really provided a foundation for EHRs and client app developers to build APIs to access information. And then the Argonaut project just kept rolling. So 2017, a provider directory guide was published. 18, accelerating the CDS Hooks initiative. 19, work to do to R4, clinical notes and provenance, and ultimately adding all this US core, initial subscriptions. And in 2020 beyond, looking at bulk data, granular access, patient lists. And I'll talk about these projects in detail as I walk through the overview of the Argonauts. But this is just to kind of try to put on one slide what's occurred over the past 6 years. And within that 6 years, there was a few kind of pretty big events, even in the very first 4 years. Is care quality, implementing the Argonaut provider directory specification, Commonwealth incorporating services for document access, an ONC, reporting over 50% of the 100 certified EHRs using FHIR APIs, and of course the major event in January of that year, that Apple announcing with their HealthKit integration that they're leveraging the Argonaut DS22 implementation guide, putting patient records in the hands of patients. So very, very exciting time. And of course, the work continues, but for 4 short years from the initiation of Argonaut to things actually being adopted. So we're going to take a tour through some of the prior initiatives where we're headed. So this is a list of all of the initiatives we've run over the past 5 years. It's a decent sized list, but you'll notice if you divide it by the number of years, we run about 2 to 3 a year, depending on how you count. And what I'll do is I'll talk through some of these highlighted in bold. So up first is Smart on FHIR. This is a big one, and this is in 2015. So if you went back to that timeline, the JSON task force was 2014, and Argonaut was formed in the kind of the winter of 2014. By summer, Smart on FHIR was seen as an opportunity to provide access to those health data stores, access to EHRs. And so Smart on FHIR provides the guidance to how to deploy OAuth 2.0 in healthcare. The Argonaut community, several vendors actively provided testing and feedback. And then there was actually a security review done by an external consultant to give confidence in the approach of the specification. Argonaut, what's kind of fun about this one, and I think it's, we set precedent with some of the others, is that Argonaut spent a bunch of time in the summer of 2015, and then, moved on to other projects after this seemed to be successful and launched. And then last year, the steering committee got together and said, hey, we could go further in granular controls or granular permissions. So a big part of last year was spent on how do we mature the spec even further, so someone can grant access to, instead of at the resource level, maybe a category level, saying, hey, all vital signs, or maybe you want to give access to a specific lab observation. And so that guidance is actually working through HL7 right now. Josh Mandel stepped up, fantastically to say, hey, let's not just end this Argonaut initiative with a guidance. Let's actually ballot it. So step forward, and there's actually an active ballot in the May last month. And so we're actively reconciling comments with the idea it'll be published later this fall. I should pause here. This content of slides, all these initiatives, there are a variety of folks involved. So I mentioned the, 4 or 5 Argonaut contractors, but these specs and the outcomes, these are the folks in some cases, facilitating and writing things down, but the guides themselves are truly the work of the community. And that's also me saying some of these slides I may have stolen from those folks or borrowed. So the credit here is, across a whole variety of folks for these initiatives. And another real kind of neat thing though with Smart on FHIR is it is required in the ONC 21st Century Cures update, good old G10. So, if you're working towards certification, this is one you'll have to account for. And if you want more detail on granular permissions, I think and there's actually a few smart talks already about folks who've deployed Smart on FHIR, but Josh will be giving a talk later today specifically on smart and granular permissions. The next big project in Argonaut was the data query and document query guide. This is, again, another one launched in that 2015, and the Argonauts raced ahead to do testing on the data access framework that ONC had drafted. This, we learned a lot in terms of how the vendors were going to implement the API, different search capabilities, different responses, and so this helped shape the very first, the sprints that were run in the summer of 2015, in the fall, helped shape the original data query guide, and also became the de facto, as a result of shaping that guide and all the input, became kind of the de facto standard on DSTU2. But we didn't end there. I think sometimes folks say, Argonaut, this feedback came earlier this week was, hey, Argonaut, you're not a standards development organization, but you wrote this huge implementation guide that got used across the industry. Like, isn't that a standard? And I think that's a fair question about this particular guide in 2016. And I think we recognize that balloting at HL7 is an important thing. It engages a whole nother community. It's a whole nother formal process for commenting. And so since then, you'll notice most of the Argonaut projects, when they end, if there's continued interest, do go through the HL7 ballot process and cycle. And this particular IG did, and it went through with the kind of moniker US Core, which is a merging of a few other projects. And so I'd be amiss if I didn't talk about good old US Core here at this stage. So US Core is not a, quote, solely an Argonaut thing. It's an HL7 product, but it's a product of US realm produced FHIR profiles. It's meant to be kind of a single point of starting if you're doing a US project, if you're a payer, public health, quality. It's meant to be a foundational set of profiles. And so across the HL7 community, folks are building directly on top of it. And it's meant to be, be broadly applicable. Since a lot of the original requirements were from Argonaut and the provider, thinking about provider and patient access, we have had to tweak things as we go. Like, we've learned some good things from the payers. We were too tight in some areas, or quality. And we've made attempts to make sure US FHIR Core does have that broad applicability. And we're, of course, happy to have folks continue to engage at HL7 to give that feedback. So the bottom line here is the Argonaut IG, first published, was the kind of the de facto standard on DSTU2. But any of the future work, subsequent work, has been rolled into the US FHIR Core, which has been formally balloted at HL7. We did actually ballot a STU3 version of FHIR STU3. But folks, some vendors skipped STU3, a few did it, but looking forward, looks like FHIR R4 will be the next place the industry really resets on, and there's a published version of US Core available there. One thing I want to call out in that specification, and I'll pull it up here. First off, the version that this is another thing that's named in the EHIR's update. The named version is 3.1.1. It is important. We have done further work. So if you were to look at the directory published versions here, I'll just pull this up for folks who are familiar here. You'll see a continuous build, and you'll actually see that we submitted a ballot in December of this year. And so there's a team of us, Eric Haas, myself, and Gay Dolan, are actively working to reconcile those comments. We thought we'd get a small ballot, maybe we'd get a break, maybe 20 or 30 comments. We got another 90 plus comments, which are always great. So always improving the spec. And I think a few big outcomes from there is we added a whole new section. I'll pull up the continuous build because I'm really proud of the work that the team has done, and a whole new section on conformance expectations to help better understand the definition of a must support. The other piece of the spec I want to call out is both clinical notes and basic provenance. So if you're looking for the guidance on clinical notes, there is no Argonaut clinical notes guide. It's all rolled into this spec. And I say rolled in through a formal ballot process with active comments. We've got tons of comments on here, and had a great connectathon to try to improve, how you access the kind of comment. We kind of joked the name, the common clinical notes set. Another piece here is the basic provenance. For folks who are implementing the latest US CDI version 1, provenance was a named data class, and there's lots of kind of background and guidance on the thinking of how provenance would evolve as a doctor or a user reconciles information to a new EHIR or is passed through maybe no changes, a whole variety of scenarios. And to go with that, there's of course a formal provenance profile in the spec, and in that provenance profile, guidance on where provenance shall be used. So We did give a talk earlier this week, Eric and I, on US Core. You could obviously see more details there, or just directly dig into the spec. We hope it's readable, and if it's not, at the bottom of every page, there's a spot for comment to provide feedback, and we're always happy to take additional feedback. Okay, next initiative out there, CDS Hooks, so Clinical Decision Support. Hooks, vendor agnostic remote decision support specification. It's funny, you know, you step back from some of these guys, the Argonaut project as a whole, and you know, a lot of them have I kind of classify in mind as foundational guides. They're not meant to solve a single use case, but provide a foundation to enable a whole variety of use cases. And so CDS Hooks is meant to, you know, hook directly into the user workflow to provide information back to that user. It's great in that it's been used in a whole variety of cases. You know, most recently there's a new Da Vinci guide for, you know, coverage requirements discovery to provide providers at the time they're ordering diagnostics or treatments information on the patient's coverage, which is under development. So in terms of the Argonaut role, you know, we provide some support to the March of CDS Hooks 1.0, you know, helped draft a quick start guide, help the security risk assessment, but in no way can the Argonaut claim success for CDS Hooks. There's, you know, Kevin Shackleton and Isaac Fetter and Dennis Patterson and Bryn Rhodes. There's a whole team of people that continue to work on CDS Hooks and evolve this project. The Argonaut just had a very blip moment in time, 1 year effort to kind of provide a sprint effort to it. And just a little more on CDS Hooks here to give folks a picture. You know, the idea, and this is pulled from the spec, that, you know, a user may be placing an order. That order may trigger a hook to a remote decision support service. That service can execute its own rules or maybe request additional FHIR data, and then respond with either an information card, which is just kind of FYI, or could have guidance in it, a suggestion card, which a user could then select and, you know, switch to medication or take another action, or could actually provide a link to launch a smart app directly in that user's workflow. So within there, you know, here's a quick picture of the 1.0 spec. The 1.1 is under ballot reconciliation, so that should be published soon. Another part of CDS Hooks that's incredibly important is the sandbox. For folks who, I know there's a mix of audiences on the phone. I know we have developers, analysts, project managers, clinicians. I can't, sandboxes are very important. I think it was New Orleans, maybe 2018. We were sitting around a table. Remember, we used to sit around tables together. And, you know, we had this moment where a few of us were talking about the spec, and someone was working the reference implementation and said, hey, the spec doesn't match the reference implementation. And it was probably a quiet side conversation. So I'm, okay, let me just change the sandbox. And so they changed the sandbox, and, you know, we continued to work and continued, you know, but it wasn't 10 minutes later when 3 people on the table said, man, my integration with the sandbox is broken. And we said, well, what do you mean? Or you're not, the cards aren't coming back correctly. And so we'd realized that the developers at that particular moment had coded to the sandbox, not the spec, just like, you know, you do, because you trust that the sandbox reflects the spec. And so the importance of, you know, eating your own dog food and creating your own software to test the specification and then have folks testing against it. You know, it's a lesson that, you know, for anyone who's writing a spec, it can't be emphasized enough, the importance of actually taking the spec, turning it into real code, and then, you know, testing against it. Good standards are built that way. Okay, Dennis is talking about CDS Hooks later this week. Check it out. Up next, the FHIR bulk data API. So this is, you know, Dr. Rucker mentioned this in his talk today, the importance of bulk data, and I have to tip my hat to him in terms of kind of the drumbeat of the vision around bulk data, that it's come a long ways. And the folks at Boston Children's and SMART have done a fantastic job with this one. And it's you know, the idea to enhance FHIR to access population level data. Again, another foundational guide. Existing FHIR APIs, you know, they work great for small amounts of data, but if you're trying to export, you know, large number of patients or get, you know, grab a whole bunch of patients chart, it may require thousands of requests. And so this particular guide defines a standardized FHIR way to export a bulk set of data. Of course, pre-authorized clients, there's some rules around security. You can't just, anyone can do this. But it's a very powerful spec for research, for public health. One of the use cases I thought was super interesting is some payers and providers and have patient member attribution lists that they're trying to, they're responsible for this set of patients, and so the payer wants to grab information on this chunk of patients and exchange who they're responsible for supporting some of the value-based care contracts. And so an implementation guide is written around how to use a bulk data API to do this. So the Argonauts were involved in this in the early days to do testing in 2018. I think Dan Gottlieb has hosted over 6 different connectathons and seen lots of progress. There is another example here of there is a ballot out that just closed last month, about 55 comments, which is great, which we'll work through this summer with the idea that it's published for use very likely this fall. So another great spec to check out. And if you want to go deep in bulk data, tip of the hat to Dan. He'll be teaching, going deep on this later this week. You should check it out. Okay, up next, smart web messaging. Oh, and these are, Argonaut kind of tacked on to allow these to accelerate for a year, and smart web messaging is another example of that. So when we talked about CDS hooks, you return that potential smart app launch card. You may launch that smart app, you may interact with that smart app, but when you're done, how does, if you prepped an order, you made some note in a scratchpad, how does that communication, how does that get back in if you're trying to reintegrate that into the EHR workflow? So it's going to communicate. Oh, you guys hear the thunder here. Conversation around that led to the development of smart web messaging. And so that, once you've done that work in that smart app, passing back that information back to save that clinician some time and mental effort. Now the Argonaut piece took a little bit of a spin. And we tested some of the smart web pieces, but we were really focused on this requirement from CMS, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act, the PAMA Act, which at the time it was requirement that in 2021, which is still working through that. Anytime a provider responsible for Medicare patients places an order, that they have to for imaging or high cost orders have to consult with an external service for an appropriate use criteria score, so that because there's such high cost, making sure that there was good reason to place this order. And so testing was done to kind of round out, what implementing PAMA within CDS hooks looks like, and maturing smart web messaging was part of that. So there's a draft spec specifically CDS hooks for PAMA. My understanding of the CMS regulation is right now, folks are expected to, they're in this kind of trial period, I think, in terms of reporting this information on claim, but at some point in the future will be required to report which service they used, and I think maybe the score. But the very important things that are coming. The latest build here is noted. There was a ballot last September, and Carl Anderson is leading the charge to reconcile that. And also, there's a sandbox for this one out there too that you can integrate and experiment with your EHR. So later this week, the 10th, check out Smart Web Messaging. Or folks who are watching this live or later on record, any of these presentations should be available within the DevDays overall agenda. Okay, up next, patient lists. So this was one we ran last year. So the idea is, within EHR, there's a list of patients you may be seeing for the day, maybe a list on a particular location. How do you service that up to a mobile app? There are kind of different approaches to that. And so this particular project developed a general framework for exposing those EHR patient-facing lists to a mobile device. Or an external device. It is important to note, through discussions on this, the idea of creating the list remotely is quite complex and varies by EHRs, and so we set that aside and just focused on access. So a few connectons are hosted. There's a draft implementation guide out there. Some really great testing was done on this. And in terms of experience, this is an example of one that, we got some good experience, and this may go to HL7 ballot in the future. But right now, we'll see how the interest lies. It was just done last year, as you can see with the other initiatives. We're not afraid to let them sit for a little bit to see how they stew. See if they improve with age, and before picking them up to make sure that they're formalized into a formal standard. But if you want to check out more, Eric Haas is leading a talk later this week on this one. It should be a great session. Okay, a few really historical ones that I thought about dropping, but I thought, nah, one more time. So provider directory, how do you find a certain practitioner, by specialty, maybe a specific clinic? This is a problem that the Argonauts tackled in 2016 and developed a guide on the FHIR STU3 API. There's a published guide out there. And I think there are kind of two parts that were incredibly important for this project. One is the organizational relationships. So fleshing out how practitioner and practitioner role provider can be associated with multiple organizations, and how you schedule that, or how organizations can be part of other organizations. Fairly complex stuff, and I think there's some really nice relationship diagrams that we developed in this spec with Brian Postlewaite from Australia. And part of this was picked up in the care quality implementation of their own internal provider directory. Care quality being an organization that stitches a variety of networks together with their rules of the road, using this provider directory. So just kind of basic capabilities. It's a pretty basic set of capabilities. And since this was 5 years ago, there had been other provider directory initiatives. And so if it were me, I think it's good to know the Argonaut did a run at this and published some of these, relationships of how things fit together. But I absolutely, it's 2021. DaVinci has done additional work, and there's some requirements from CMS in terms of accessing kind of a new FHIR interface into health insurance plans and networks. And so I definitely would check out the DaVinci PDEX PlanNet guide here if I were actively pursuing a provider directory. Another project that got interest again this year, we almost restarted this initiative this year, was patient and provider scheduling. So there is a published Argonaut scheduling guide to provide vendor agnostic approaches to scheduling, booking appointments. It's interesting, several vendors that participate in this before we even started this initiative, and even today, have their own patient portals, and within those patient portals, you can schedule a visit. This initiative was to try to pull out some of that functionality, so a third-party app could poll and figure out what's available, and then book things through that client application. And there are a few actually third-party industry players out there who have either leveraged part of the Argonaut API that's published here, leverage some kind of specific custom APIs to an EHR, in some cases kind of a mix of FHIR APIs and custom APIs. And so I don't think I would consider the patient and provider scheduling kind of solved, but this definitely pushed the envelope forward. There's one vendor who implemented a huge chunk of this. And the reason this got so much attention earlier this year is, how do I schedule my COVID vaccine? And we kicked off, all right, what do we do with this? And I think there was a nice talk earlier today on smart scheduling links. And so we looked at that. And one of the pieces that jumped out for us as we started to think about, all right, as Argonauts, are we going to pick this up again? Is we did kind of a survey. We did a kind of a few week sprint to say, all right, let's talk about what are the components of scheduling. And so we kind of broke it down this chart. This is kind of our loose interpretation of some of the functionality and scheduling. And I actually would happily take some feedback on this offline. But the idea that the most basic thing is, what's the known availability? Like find locations and availability, maybe provide a link to complete the booking. So the idea is it's just kind of surfacing what's out there. There's, the user management, whether a patient exists or not, that's all managed once you actually link to complete the booking. More detailed appointment booking, maybe specific types or specific providers. So this is maybe filtering on an area, but still you're linking to the site to booking. You're not booking it through the app. And then direct booking, it's a fair bit more complex. You're able to create a new patient, maybe retrieve existing appointments, and then do direct API booking all the way remote from the EHR, remote from the scheduling system. And so we talked through and developed this together in that kind of couple-week sprint. And then we actually went through and talked about, COVID, how folks could do slots and appointment availability. And ultimately found is a large number of the vendors that participate in Argonaut already had some capability, and not some, a fair bit of capability already implemented using the Argonaut scheduling ID. Epic did take a step further and do some implementation of smart scheduling links because they had customers interested in that. But the other folks, other participants, graciously, we took time to post, hey, here's how you do some of this functionality already with these EHRs, and decided that the smart scheduling links is an important project out there. Some of the pharmacies, grocery stores, other places that provide vaccines did proceed, and there's actually a very active Zulip channel on it. It's really neat to see that progress. But the Argonaut said, you know what, we'll publish the functionality we currently have across these folks, and we'll stand down, and maybe we'll pick this up in the future, but we're optimistic. Don't see this as something we need to solve in this moment. And part of that was, the biggest thing unfortunately, around the world, is supply of the vaccines was a major issue. And hopefully that will no longer be an issue around the world soon. But anyway, so provider and patient scheduling, it's a more challenge. It sounds so simple to me on the surface, but again, like many of these problems, you dig in, and there's lots of how do you reserve it before someone else does, and all sorts of good stuff to be found. Okay, so what are we doing for 2021, and how do we get there? At the end of every year, November, December, we start kicking around the conversations of what are we going to do for the next year. And I used to joke kind of with Mickey and others, like, gosh, are we going to have a big list of items? Like, are we, how interested are folks, what are we going to do next? And it's always amazing how many, the opportunities out there for the Argonaut community and other accelerated communities similar to Argonaut. So, some broad categories: administrative use cases came up again, additional security guidance, patient empowerment and corrections, huge one. Maybe advanced prior initiatives, that's always of interest because some of them, maybe didn't fully go through the standards process, or didn't get as much adoption as we thought. And so we go through kind of this voting cycle and prioritization cycle. I say voting. We don't have strict you get one vote per organization. It's very much a consensus building process to try to work through a logical project that's good for everyone and good for the industry. And so ultimately, for the 2021, we settled on 2 major initiatives that are launched at this point, FHIR Write, and I'll talk a minute about that. But basically the idea, FHIR is great to read, but we all want to write back to those data stores. Those EHRs provide our own content, and there's not that much guidance, even within the context of US CDI and US Core. And so that's something that we hope to fix. And subscriptions, wow, what a great project. We took it on a few years ago, and it's continued. I'll talk a little bit more about our plans for that. A few others under consideration. Native app security best practices for folks who read the CURES update rule. There's some requirements for refresh tokens, and we thought maybe we'd do a whole initiative on that. We actually hosted about 5 calls specifically on native app security best practices, and decided that it's not quite a full-blown initiative for us to spend a year on. But we agreed to a few very specific ballot comments against the Smart on FHIR, since there is a Smart on FHIR ballot going on. That we as a group submitted. We all kind of voted on those and hope that those will be included in the final production of the specification so that everyone can benefit from some of those best practices. EHI export, still on the table potentially for this year. We typically pick about 2 to 3-ish projects a year. There's not a formal rule. Our only kind of hard and fast rule I think we have at Argonaut is try to keep it to a year. So any one of these could be multi-year projects, but try to scope it to a year, and then we'll put it down and move on, and maybe come back to it. But let's scope it so we can get to a good finish spot within a year. So EHI information export, we're kicking that around. That's a requirement in the ONC rule that a patient would have the right to request a copy of their. Just like we have this HIPAA rule to have access to our chart. This is requesting everything in electronic format. So the EHI expert doesn't define necessarily exactly how you do the request, and doesn't necessarily define the format. So there's a little bit of work there, potentially improvement to bulk, but we'll see. We'll make likely a decision this summer on whether to proceed. And of course, US CDI version 2 is hanging out there for folks who are watching ONC. They promised that they'll produce version 2 in July. I hope they make good on that promise. I believe they will, because we look forward to, as the Argonaut community, the HL7 community, the broader clinical technology community responding to make sure that we can put a good set of design profiles, APIs to go with it to implement those new elements. All right, so just a bit on FHIR Write. So the goal is a standard approach in FHIR. You can see we're still trying to nail down use cases. You know, do we want to do unsolicited data by patients? Maybe provider actively monitoring a patient for a specific problem or a set of abnormal observations? Device ordering, is it going to be, are we going to support bring your own devices? Is it going to be a workflow of providers ordering a device, handing it off to the patient? And kind of trust comes into play here. Are we going to, you know, certain devices, you know, a blood pressure cuff that I've ordered for a patient, that can, I'm happy to have that directly write to the data store, and the nurse or, you know, someone else can review that information and maybe adjust patient medications without a visit. There's been research that shows that works incredibly well. But what data should go into a holding tank? What should have, you know, flagged as patient, you know, patient report, the provenance of it? So there's some gnarly things here that we're still trying to work through. And so we're in kind of the initial scope and use case right now. But, you know, this timeline is, we're starting to leak in the summer a little bit on use cases, but the goal is that, you know, some early draft implementation guide, reference implementation in preparation for the September Connectathon. And we'll see where this lands. I mean, I think if we get enough input on this and testing in the fall, there's potential that this could mature in a way that it's a proposal for a future round of US Core. But we got to work through, you know, US Core has some maturity steps before we add things to it. But we'll see. FHIR Write's important. A lot of folks are interested in, and we'll see how the year progresses. Subscriptions. I didn't mention subscriptions in our prior efforts, because I wanted to mention here. The power of tell me when data changes. It's pretty sweet. I think this is another example of a foundational project that Argonaut has picked up. And it's fun, you know, FHIR Release 4, the idea that you have these kind of complex FHIR search strings to kind of communicate to the server, you know, if this query is met, then I want information to say, wow, that's complex for folks to implement. Migration to a topic-based model with subscription topic, and to kind of formalize, you know, and to not rely on FHIR search strings, but allow folks to do some implementation ahead of time, and then pair that with status, and then of course the prior subscription resource. Tip of the hat to Gino and folks testing have made a ton of progress, made a lot of very good updates to FHIR R5. So many good updates to R5 that folks said, geez, it'd be really nice to have some of these in FHIR R4, or maybe this thing called FHIR R4B. And so one of the first parts of the Argonaut project was, gosh, can we get those new resources back into FHIR R4B, which is an interim release between R4 and R5. And since they, you know, were brand new, the FHIR management group gave approval to that. And I think Gino said it best, all the functionality have to wait. So when R4B publishes, we'll have access to using those resources. This was ballot in January. So part of the Argonaut project is just helping reconcile those comments, and the latest build is mentioned there. In terms of timelines, oops, Gino, if you missed it, I checked it out. The recording is already posted from yesterday. He gave a great talk on subscriptions. I think this is, I think it's a game changer. I'm super excited to see how subscription ripples through the industry. And so, you know, project goals, you know, working through the backport IG, you know, get R5 ready to publish. So it'll be ready to publish for a while, but the, you know, backport IG is a big focus right now, with another Connectathon plan later this year. And if you want to join the standards arena, one topic is, I thought this was funny, I had to add this, should we add a faxing channel? There was a joke in the US marketplace for a long time of axe the fax, how do we get rid of this thing? And I thought it was funny that Graham and in the Zulip chat thought, maybe, do we need a faxing channel to communicate a subscription event? So if you want to join the conversation, there's a decent chance that fax could be added. Okay, so here we go, wrap up. Participation, there is a Zulip channel Argonaut Confluence page, which we're working to improve and add some of these prior initiatives to. We're not quite up to date there. You can contact any of the folks leading these initiatives. We're all as friendly as we can be. The thing to emphasize here is we want you, we need you. These specs are only as good as the feedback and participation we get. So, you know, engage the community. We're an odd bunch, but friendly bunch, and we try to play together nicely. And so it's not just the Argonaut community, but the broader FHIR community, Inc. accelerators. We are all in this to improve clinical care and ultimately patient outcomes. So with that, you've got the overview of the Argonaut initiatives, where we're headed for this year, and I'll just pause to see what questions have come in here. Josh, what do we got?
I see I see one that just came in here, Brett. Is Argonaut considering taking up bulk data import this year?
That is a good question. We did discuss it a little bit, and there were a few folks who were interested, but not quite enough this year to take it as a project. So it may be under consideration for 2022, but not for 2021.
All right, and that's the only question I see in the Q&A. I saw one in chat related to the slides. To answer that question, it was how do we get the links to the slides? If you go into the documents section in Whova, they'll be available there for you. So, but yeah, I don't see any more questions here, Brett. Did you have anything else you wanted to follow up with?
No, this is great. No, thanks for, hope folks got what they expected out of the overview, and I hope everyone has a very productive Dev Days and rest of their week.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Brett, for that awesome presentation on Argonaut and an overview of the projects there. And thank you all for joining. This will conclude the presentation. Thank you.